The rain came down in erratic waves, slanting across the windows of the downtown Seattle hotel like it had something to prove. Inside the lobby bar, the clink of ice against glass and the low hum of soft jazz filled the space with a kind of half-hearted warmth. Ilara Quinn sat alone at the end of the bar, nursing a glass of dry white wine and trying not to look like someone who just had her entire day canceled. She was supposed to be at a publishing workshop across town, but the keynote speaker fell ill, and the event was postponed. She considered going back to her room, but the thought of staring at beige walls and answering emails held no appeal. She wore a navy wool coat still damp at the cuffs, her hair curling slightly from the mist. She looked like someone who read a lot, because she did, and who didn't care much for crowds because she didn't. She was 30 and carried it like a quiet truth, not trying to impress anyone anymore, not needing to. She sipped her wine and scribbled something in a leather notebook she always carried. Just a sentence, a phrase, something about the way strangers sit in silence but still feel each other's presence. Then he sat down beside her. Not too close, just enough to share the air. She didn't look at him at first, but she noticed the way the bartender straightened slightly, like this man was someone important, or at least someone who always tipped well. He ordered bourbon, neat, his voice low and steady. There was something odd about him. His calm, maybe, or the way he didn't look at his phone even once. Most men at hotel bars scrolled aimlessly, waiting to be distracted. He just watched the rain, eyes sharp but tired. After several minutes of silence, he spoke. "Are you here for the media summit?" Ilara shook her head. "No, publishing workshop, canceled." He nodded like that explained everything. They didn't talk for a while after that. Then she surprised herself by saying, "You look like someone who hates small talk." His mouth tugged slightly at one corner. "I do." She laughed. It was the first time all day. He told her his name was Callum, just Callum, no last name. He didn't ask for hers. They spoke about books they never finished, cities they wanted to leave, people they missed but would never admit it to. He didn't talk like a man trying to impress her. He talked like someone grateful to be off the clock. There was a weight to his words, like everything he said had been edited down to the truth. She liked that. Most people filled silence with noise. He let it be. At one point, her phone buzzed with a message from her sister. She didn't check it. She didn't want the moment to shift. Callum asked what she did, and when she said she was an editor, he only nodded again. No follow-up questions. No jokes about red pens. They stayed like that for over 2 hours, talking like old friends who forgot they'd just met. When the bar began to thin out and the jazz got softer, he paid the tab without asking and stood. She stood too. They didn't say, "Want to come up?" or "Should we do this?" It just happened the way falling asleep does. Gradually, then all at once. His room was on the 21st floor, and it overlooked the water. The storm was still rolling in, clouds thick like smoke. In the dim light, he looked less like a businessman and more like a man who didn't sleep much, who had too many thoughts and too few people to share them with. He touched her like someone who didn't believe in second chances, like every minute mattered more than the next. In the morning, the room was quiet. The rain had stopped. Lara woke up alone, the other side of the bed still warm. There was no note on the pillow, no number, just a clean glass by the sink and the faint scent of his cologne. She stood by the window, wrapped in a hotel robe, looking out at the gray sky and thinking about how easily people pass through each other's lives, and how rarely it means something. She didn't know then that it meant everything. 5 years later, Ilara Quinn's life had settled into a rhythm she hadn't planned, but had grown to respect. Mornings began early in her small Portland apartment, tucked above a used bookstore she part-owned with her college friend Sadie. The ceilings were low, the windows drafty, and the hardwood floors creaked under every step, but it was hers. It was a quiet life, structured around two anchors, her daughter Maisie and the slow, methodical work of freelance editing. She never craved more than what she had, but sometimes on long evenings or during cold walks to the store, she wondered about the choices that had led her here. Maisie was 5, almost 6, and already asking questions that were hard to answer. She was observant in a way that sometimes unnerved adults, like she saw things they didn't think children noticed. She had amber-colored eyes that seemed to glow in certain light, and a certain stillness in her that reminded Ilara of someone she hadn't seen in over 5 years. Sometimes when Maisie looked at her without smiling, Without blinking, Ilara felt an ache that was both fear and awe. It wasn't just that she saw Callum in her daughter's face. It was the way she was, measured, focused, almost too quiet for her age. That morning, Maisie had insisted on wearing a striped raincoat, even though the forecast promised sun. "I don't trust the weather, man," she said matter-of-factly, adjusting the buttons with her tiny fingers. Ilara had smiled, tucked a curl behind her daughter's ear, and packed her a snack shaped like hearts and stars. It was a weekday, which meant drop-off at kindergarten, followed by 5 hours of editing, a memoir from an aging tech executive who thought every sentence needed to begin with, "I realized then." By mid-afternoon, Ilara found herself in a coffee shop on Hawthorne using their stronger Wi-Fi to upload revisions. The cafe was a cozy mix of retro furniture and overgrown plants. Maisie's teacher had posted a new photo from the class project, and out of habit, Ilara clicked. It was an image of Maisie standing by a bulletin board, arms crossed, looking directly into the camera with a small, serious smile. Someone had tagged the school. Someone had reposted it to a local parenting forum. Ilara didn't think much of it at first. That night, as she folded laundry and Maisie lay on the rug, sketching a fox with orange crayon, Ilara's phone buzzed. It was Sadie, sending a link. No context, just, "Is this real?" Ilara clicked. It was a social media post from a business news outlet, a screen capture of a TV interview. Callum Vexley, founder and CEO of Vexley Communications, speaking on live television. Below the image, someone had circled the corner of the screen where a framed photo sat on his office shelf. The photo wasn't of Maisie. It was of a man who looked like her, Callum himself, taken when he was about the same age. The similarity was unsettling, but that wasn't what made Ilara freeze. Beneath the post, someone had commented, "Saw this kid in a Portland school photo today. She's a copy of this guy. Weird coincidence?" There were only a few likes. No one else had responded. Yet, Ilara's chest tightened, her breath shallow. She turned her phone over and sat there, staring at the floor, listening to the sound of her daughter humming to herself while she colored. She remembered the way Callum had touched her face that one night, how he had kissed her like he didn't expect anything after, how he had disappeared without a trace, and how for years she had convinced herself that keeping his name from Maisie was the safest, kindest thing. She hadn't told a soul, not her sister, not even Sadie, who had once guessed but never pushed. Ilara had built her life on quiet decisions, on protecting Maisie from instability, from entitlement, from ghosts in expensive suits. She had never searched for him, though there were nights she typed his name into her browser and hovered her finger over the enter key. Now, without her doing anything at all, the world had turned its gaze toward them. She didn't know what Callum knew, or if he even remembered her. He was a public figure now, with employees, a media presence, and a carefully curated life. She was just a woman with a daughter and a pile of deadlines. She stood, picked up the laundry basket, and forced her body to move like everything was fine. Maisie looked up at her and asked, "Mom, why do some people have big buildings with their names on them?" Ilara sat down beside her and touched her hand gently. "Because some people want to be remembered," she said, her voice barely steady, "and some people want to disappear." Maisie looked back at her with those eyes again, curious and calm, as if she already understood more than she should. Ilara smiled tightly, then pulled her into a hug and held her there longer than usual, as if time could be delayed if she only gripped hard enough. She didn't know what was coming, but something had shifted, and there was no going back. It wasn't until Ilara stepped off the plane in San Francisco that the knot in her stomach truly began to tighten. The city was loud and bright in that West Coast way that made her feel like she'd stepped into someone else's life. Her friend Sadie had begged her to come. Well, more like pressured her in the warm, manipulative way only close friends could. Sadie had recently sold her debut novel to a major publisher, and the launch party was being hosted by one of the company's lead investors, a man known for funding literary startups and media-adjacent ventures. Ilara hadn't planned on attending. It was too far, too fancy, and too connected to a world she had carefully chosen to stay outside of, but Sadie insisted. "It'll be good for you," she had said. "A break. You can hide in the corner and drink overpriced wine while I schmooze." Ilara had packed lightly, a black dress she rarely wore, modest heels, and the same lipstick she kept at the back of her drawer for weddings or funerals. She wasn't sure which this felt more like. The event was held in a glass-walled space in the financial district, all exposed brick and strategically placed modern art. There were servers in black suits carrying trays of figs and prosciutto, and a jazz trio played something that sounded like it wanted to be Miles Davis but wasn't. Ilara found herself tucked beside a large window overlooking the Bay Bridge, sipping a cocktail that tasted mostly like lime and nerves. She hadn't spoken to anyone besides Sadie, and even that conversation had been brief. Just a quick hug and a promise to catch up after the crowd thinned out. She was watching the lights flicker across the water when she felt it. A shift in the room, like gravity had subtly changed direction. A hush, almost imperceptible, fell over the crowd. People straightened, adjusted their jackets, turned slightly toward the entrance. Ilara didn't look right away, but when she did, she felt it like a punch just below the ribs. Callum Vexley. He looked exactly as he had in the interview clip. Tall, composed, devastating in a way that wasn't conventionally handsome, but undeniably commanding. His hair was darker now, a bit longer, but the posture was the same. The sharpness in his jawline, the slight crease between his brows like he was always halfway through solving a problem no one else could see. He moved through the crowd like he owned the building. Maybe he did. He was shaking hands, making brief conversation, his smile polite and brief. And then he looked up and saw her. For a moment, Ilara was certain he didn't recognize her. How could he? One night, years ago, no names, no photos, but his eyes paused on her just a second too long. Not with confusion, with recognition. It was subtle, the way his posture shifted, the tightening in his expression. He didn't react outwardly, but Ilara's pulse started pounding in her ears. She turned back to her drink, pretending she hadn't noticed, pretending it was possible to pretend. Minutes passed, maybe more. She tried to focus on anything else. The music, the conversation nearby, the taste of citrus and gin. But then she felt a presence beside her, and before she even turned her head, she knew. "You're not in publishing," he said quietly. His voice was the same, calm, low, slightly amused. It made her want to shatter her glass. She turned slowly, met his gaze. "Neither were you." He studied her, not just her face, but all of her, like he was trying to see through 5 years in 5 seconds. "I didn't expect," he began, then stopped. "This isn't coincidence, is it?" "I was invited," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "My friend wrote a book. This has nothing to do with you." He nodded slowly, but his expression told her he didn't quite believe her. "Do you live here?" "No, Portland." He paused. "With your family?" The question was casual, but the weight behind it was suffocating. Ilara stared at him. She wanted to lie, to brush him off, but she didn't. Instead, she asked, "Are you always like this? Showing up in someone's life 5 years later, asking questions you don't really want the answers to?" "I want the answers," he said evenly. "I've wanted them for a long time." Something cracked in her, but she didn't let it show. "You didn't leave a number or a name." "I thought I was doing the right thing," he said. "It was a mess. I was a mess. That night, I wasn't supposed to be there. I wasn't supposed to talk to anyone." "You did more than talk." He didn't flinch. "And I haven't stopped thinking about it since." She said nothing. "I saw a photo," he said more softly now, "of a little girl, a school post. She looks like me." Ilara felt her throat tighten. "She has your eyes," he added. "But the rest, it's like looking in a mirror." She could feel her hands start to shake. She placed the glass down carefully. "You don't get to show up and say things like that," she whispered. "You don't get to walk into my life and suddenly ask, 'Is she mine?'" he asked, gently but firmly. Ilara didn't answer, not with words. She just turned and walked away, through the blur of strangers and music and curated elegance, trying to breathe, trying not to cry. Behind her, she knew Callum hadn't moved. He didn't chase her, but something told her he would. Ilara didn't answer his calls for 3 days. She let the messages pile up, each one more careful and composed than the last. Callum didn't beg or plead. He didn't lose his temper. Instead, he asked for honesty, for time, for a chance to talk, not in passing, not in public, but with the kind of quiet that only existed behind closed doors. She didn't know what unsettled her more, his persistence or the way his tone never carried expectation, Only wait. Finally, after another night of waking up in cold sweats and staring at the ceiling for hours, she texted him an address and a time. Neutral ground. A small cafe near her apartment, one that was never crowded, never noisy, and never asked questions. It was raining again. A light drizzle that dusted the pavement and made the city seem quieter than usual. She wore a gray sweater that had frayed at the cuffs and jeans that didn't flatter her. But she didn't care. There was no one she was trying to impress, only someone she needed to face. Callum was already seated when she arrived, tucked into a corner booth by the window, a cup of black coffee in front of him, untouched. He stood when he saw her, like some ingrained habit from another life, but she didn't acknowledge it. She slid into the booth across from him without a word. He sat again, folding his hands loosely on the table. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them buzzed with everything that had gone unsaid. "She's yours," Ilara said finally, not looking at him. Her voice was steady but hollow. "Maisie is your daughter." Callum exhaled slowly as if he'd been holding his breath for weeks. His fingers flexed slightly, then relaxed again. "Thank you for telling me." "I wasn't going to," she admitted. "Not ever." "Why?" She looked up at him then, really looked at him. "Because I didn't think you wanted to know. And because I didn't want to share her with a stranger who disappears without saying goodbye." He didn't argue with that, didn't try to defend his actions that night. "I regret leaving like that," he said quietly. "I thought I was protecting you from who I was, from the world I was in. It wasn't personal." "To you, maybe," she said, her voice sharp but not cruel. "But it changed everything for me." He nodded slowly. "Can I meet her?" Ilara leaned back slightly, as if his question pushed into her space. "I don't know. She doesn't know about you." "Not really. I told her he was someone I knew once. Someone far away. That's all. I want to be part of her life," he said, and his voice didn't waver. "Not just because she's mine, but because I think I could be good for her. Eventually, if you let me." She scoffed lightly. "You think you can just walk in and be a father?" "No," he said. "I don't think anything about this will be easy. But I'm here now. I'm not leaving." "You say that like it means something," she said, her voice low. "But you don't know what showing up actually costs. She's not some brand you can manage, Callum. She's a human being. She remembers everything. She feels everything." He looked genuinely hurt by that, not defensive. "I know I've missed so much already, but I don't want to keep missing it." Ilara rubbed her fingers along the edge of the table. "She's smart, smarter than most adults I know, and she doesn't warm up easily. If you want to meet her, it can't be about you. It has to be about her." "I understand." "No, I don't think you do," she said, finally meeting his eyes again. "Because if you did, you'd realize that every single move you make from here on out affects her. Not your company, not your reputation. Her. And if you screw this up, I'm not sure she'll recover from it." He didn't flinch. "Then I won't screw it up." They sat in silence for a long time after that. The rain tapped softly against the window, the rhythm calm and constant. Ilara studied his face, looking for signs of performance, of calculation. But what she saw instead was something unfamiliar on him. Humility. Not the kind that came from strategy or image maintenance, but the kind that came from fear of losing something real. "I'll arrange something small," she said finally. "No pressure. No labels. Just meeting her as someone I know." "Okay," he said, almost too softly to hear. As she stood to leave, she paused and turned back to him. "If you want to do this, you'll have to learn how to show up even when it's inconvenient, even when it's ugly. Can you do that?" He nodded once firmly. "I can." She didn't smile. She didn't soften. But something in her eyes flickered, just briefly, like a door unlocking. Then she walked out into the rain without looking back. Callum remained in the booth for a while longer, watching the window fog slowly under the weight of his own breath. Maisie didn't take to him right away. Ilara had warned Callum that she wouldn't. Her daughter was curious but cautious, especially with people who tried too hard. So when Callum first met her, at a quiet, local library during one of their weekly reading club afternoons, he said very little. He didn't bring gifts or force a smile. Instead, he sat beside Ilara at the corner table, watched Maisie build a tower out of hardcover books, and waited. Alara had introduced him simply as a friend from work, which wasn't entirely false, though the phrase tasted strange on her tongue. Maisie had eyed him for a long, quiet moment, then returned to her project without a word. After 10 minutes of silence, she finally asked, "Do you know how to stack books without them falling?" And Callum, to his credit, answered, "No, but I'd like to learn." That was the first crack in the wall. They met 3 more times that week. Once at a coffee shop where Maisie ordered hot chocolate with extra whipped cream and asked him what his job was. He gave her the simplest version he could manage. "I help people tell stories and make sure the truth doesn't get buried." And she'd squinted at him like she didn't quite believe it, but decided to let it go. The second meeting was at a park, where Callum sat stiffly on a bench while she climbed the jungle gym like a small, determined animal. The third time, she let him push her on the swing. She didn't laugh, but she didn't stop him either. And Alara, watching from a distance, felt something shift again. Not in a loud, cinematic way, but like a door slowly creaking open. But it wasn't easy. After the fourth visit, Maisie came home quiet, not upset but thoughtful in that way that made Alara nervous. That night, as she was brushing her teeth, she asked her mother, "Do friends always come back, or do some just leave?" Alara had frozen with a towel in her hands. She crouched beside her daughter, looked her in the eye and said, "Some friends leave, but the good ones stay." Maisie nodded, thoughtful again, then asked if she could sleep with the nightlight on. The next morning, Callum sent a message that he was available if Maisie wanted to go for a walk after school. Alara didn't answer for 3 hours. When she finally replied, it was a simple yes, followed by a request. No questions, no pressure, just presence. He agreed. As the days passed, Callum changed. He didn't say much about it, but Alara could see it. The emails from his office came later in the day. The phone calls were shorter. Once he even turned his phone off while they all shared lunch at a small diner, and Alara saw the subtle shake of his hand as he set the device face down. It was like watching a man trying to relearn the art of being present after years of disappearing into deadlines and data. He was clumsy with affection, unsure how to navigate the gentle boundaries of a child who didn't know she was his. He never touched her hair without asking, never called her by nicknames, never overstepped. Alara noticed that too. It was like he was trying to earn a role that most men demanded by default. But with every visit, Maisie grew a little less guarded. She began asking about his past, what his favorite cartoon had been, whether he'd ever eaten 3 popsicles in a row, why his hair always looked like someone ironed it wrong. He answered everything with a quiet kind of humor that surprised Alara. She had only known Callum in fragments. One night of vulnerability, one evening of confrontation, and now this strange, slow stretch of tenderness. One night after Maisie had gone to bed and the house was still, Alara and Callum sat across from each other at her kitchen table. The room smelled of dish soap and lemon tea. Outside it was raining again. The kind of soft, constant rain that made the world feel smaller, closer. "She's more like you than me," he said suddenly, staring at the half-empty cup in his hand. "The way she watches everything, the way she holds back." Alara didn't speak. She didn't have to. "I've spent my whole life running toward things," he continued. "Deadlines, goals, titles. Then I look at her, and I realize I've never actually stood still. Not until now." She watched him for a moment, saw the quiet weight behind his words, and asked, "And what happens now?" He looked up at her, eyes softer than she remembered. "Now I try to deserve it." That night after he left, Alara stood in Maisie's room for a long time, listening to her daughter breathe in her sleep. She thought about what it meant to let someone back into your life, not with trust, but with hope. Because hope, unlike trust, didn't demand proof. It just waited quietly, stubborn and fragile, to see what would happen next. The story broke on a Wednesday morning, and by noon, everything Alara had worked so hard to protect felt suddenly exposed. It started with a blurry photo posted by a gossip blog known more for clickbait than credibility. Callum Vexley stepping out of a children's bookstore in Portland, Maisie by his side, Alara a few steps behind. No one had noticed the photographer. No one had thought to hide. The caption beneath the image read, "Media mogul's secret family," and within hours it spread like wildfire. Other outlets picked it up, spinning their own narratives with dramatic flair. some calling it a heartwarming story of redemption, others suggesting deceit, scandal, and manipulation. Headlines range from reclusive CEO's shocking reveal, "Is he a father?" to Vexley Communications in crisis over hidden child allegation. At first, Alara didn't react. She kept her phone on silent, stayed off social media, and continued making breakfast for Maisie like any other day. But by mid-morning, the emails started coming in. Requests for comments, interviews, even book deals. Her inbox filled with strangers who had opinions about her life, her choices, and her daughter. She tried to shield Maisie from the noise, but the moment she picked her up from school, she knew something had shifted. One of the teachers pulled Alara aside, concerned. A parent had recognized Callum from the news and was already speculating. Maisie didn't say much on the drive home, but she asked quietly, "Why did someone take our picture?" Alara didn't know how to answer. Meanwhile, Callum was under siege. His company's board was furious. Investors were unsettled, demanding explanations for why their CEO had seemingly hidden a child from the public eye. One particularly aggressive media outlet accused him of orchestrating the timing to coincide with a major acquisition, suggesting he tried to use the story as a distraction or PR stunt. Callum tried to control the damage, but it was like trying to hold back a flood with bare hands. Everything he said was dissected, twisted, every gesture analyzed. By Friday, Vexley Communications had lost two major clients. Stock prices were down. Reporters had begun camping outside both Alara's apartment and Callum's penthouse in San Francisco. The privacy they had built, the quiet space they had carved out for Maisie, was gone. Alara was furious. She confronted Callum in person, meeting him at a private corner booth in a nearly empty restaurant after hours. The place was closed to the public, arranged through one of his contacts, but the tension inside was anything but private. "You promised to protect her," she said, her voice low but shaking. "You said you wouldn't bring attention. You said this would be slow, quiet." "I didn't leak anything," he replied, trying to keep his tone calm. "I don't know who did." She didn't believe him. Not completely. "But you didn't stop it either, did you? You didn't make it harder to find us. You kept taking her places in public like it wouldn't matter." "I wanted to be present," he said. "I didn't want to sneak around like she was some kind of secret. I didn't think—" "No," she cut him off. "You didn't think. Because you don't understand what this kind of exposure does to a child. She's 5, Callum. 5. You think she knows what a headline is? You think she understands why grown adults are following her with cameras?" "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it, but it wasn't enough. "I underestimated the reach. I thought I could control it." "You control everything," she snapped, leaning closer across the table. "That's what you do. You walk into a room, you make decisions, and people move around you like pawns. But this isn't business. This is her life. And you don't get to treat it like strategy." He looked gutted, truly. For the first time, Alara saw him not as a powerful man under pressure, but as someone completely and utterly lost. "I'll fix it," he said, almost in a whisper. "I don't know how yet, but I will." She didn't respond right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, but no less steady. "You don't get to fix this with a press release. The only thing you can do is step back. Let her breathe. Let her have a childhood. I don't care how much you want to be part of her life. You don't get to make that choice for her anymore. You've already taken too much." Callum looked down at his hands. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He just nodded once, slowly, and then he said something she hadn't expected. "I'll step down." Alara blinked. "From what?" "Everything. My position, the company, the board meetings, all of it." His voice was hoarse. "I've been holding on because I thought I could balance it all, but I can't. And if there's even the smallest chance that stepping away could make this easier on her, on you, I'll do it." She stared at him, stunned. She hadn't asked for that, hadn't even thought it possible, but she saw in his face that he meant it. "I don't want your sacrifice," she said quietly. "I'm not doing it for you," he replied. "I'm doing it for her." When she left the restaurant, the rain had begun again, light and almost apologetic, like the sky was trying to soften everything it had just witnessed. Alara walked slowly, coat unbuttoned, breath fogging in the air, unsure of how she felt. Relieved, overwhelmed, maybe both. She didn't know what came next. But for the first time since the story broke, she believed that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward that didn't end in disaster. Or maybe that was just the hope talking. Either way, she didn't run. The apartment was quiet that night, quieter than usual. Maisie had fallen asleep early, exhausted after a week of confusion and questions she didn't know how to ask out loud. Ilara stood by the window in the living room, arms crossed tightly over her chest, watching the streetlights blur through the misted glass. The city felt different now, as if it had turned slightly colder overnight, or maybe she had just become more aware of how thin the walls of her life really were. Everything she had built to protect Maisie, routine, distance, anonymity, had been cracked open in a matter of days. And despite all the anger, despite all the things she had said to Callum, a part of her still felt hollow in his absence. He had kept his word. In the days following their conversation, Callum had disappeared from public view. No interviews, no photos, no press statements. Then the announcement came, quietly through a 2-paragraph statement released to a single financial outlet. He was stepping down from his role at Vexley Communications indefinitely. The company's board scrambled to stabilize, spinning the decision as part of a long-term transition plan. But anyone with half a brain could read between the lines. He was walking away from the empire he had built, and he wasn't doing it for shareholders. Ilara hadn't spoken to him since. She wasn't sure if she was relieved or terrified. Part of her wanted to pick up the phone and say something, anything, but another part still felt like a wound barely stitched closed. Then 3 days after the announcement, a letter arrived. Not an email, not a message. A real envelope, hand-addressed in his handwriting, waiting in her mailbox between bills and an unsolicited political flyer. She opened it slowly with cautious hands and unfolded the paper inside. The letter wasn't long, but it wasn't rushed either. He had written it clearly, carefully, without theatrics. He apologized again, not for what had happened between them, but for not understanding sooner how deeply it had affected her. He told her he had meant it, every word of it, that he had never stopped thinking about that night in Seattle, or what it could have meant if he hadn't walked away. But mostly he wrote about Maisie, about the quiet moments he had shared with her in the past few weeks, the questions she had asked, the way she paused before speaking as if measuring the weight of her words. He said he had never met anyone like her, and that he didn't want to crowd her life or complicate it or cast a shadow she didn't ask for. He ended the letter with something Ilara didn't expect. He wrote, "You don't owe me anything. Not a seat at the table. Not forgiveness. But I will always be here if either of you ever need me. Not because it's convenient, because it's right." She read the letter twice. Then again. She folded it back along the same creases and slipped it into a drawer without knowing why. That night, sleep came late and restless, her mind playing images like a reel on repeat. Maisie's cautious smile, Callum's tired eyes, the way the rain sounded against the windows when he first said her name. 2 days later, a package arrived. Inside was a small leather-bound notebook. The first page was blank except for a handwritten note. For when she wants to ask questions and you want to answer honestly. The handwriting was his. Ilara closed the cover, pressed it gently to her chest and didn't cry, but came dangerously close. The following weekend, Maisie asked if she could draw with her book friend again. That's what she called Callum now. Not Dad. Not anything heavier than that. Just the man who had helped her arrange books by color and brought her a cinnamon muffin without raisins because he remembered she didn't like them. Ilara hesitated, then said yes. When Callum arrived, he didn't come to the door. He waited at the edge of the park, standing under a tree, as if he wasn't sure he belonged anymore. Maisie spotted him first and ran ahead, waving her small hands like flags. Ilara watched the moment from a distance, heart lodged somewhere in her throat. Callum knelt to greet Maisie, and she said something that made him laugh, softly, genuinely. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't clean, but it was real. Afterward, as they walked together in the fading light, Maisie between them, pointing out squirrels and clouds shaped like ships, Ilara glanced at Callum. His expression was quiet, almost reverent, like a man finally learning the value of what he nearly lost. Later that night, when Maisie was asleep and the apartment was still again, Ilara stood by the same window, arms crossed, watching the rain return in light, steady streaks. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if trust could be rebuilt, or if love, whatever version of it had existed once, could survive what they'd both been through. But she knew this. He had stepped back when it mattered. And then when she left the door unlocked, he didn't push it open. He waited outside, quiet, still, willing. And maybe that was how something real began again. Not with declarations, not with grand gestures, but with someone choosing to stay exactly where they'd been asked to stand. Summer arrived quietly that year, without the usual announcement of heat waves or bursts of color. Portland had always eased into its seasons gently, like someone hesitant to knock too loudly at the door. The days stretched longer, and with them came a sense of quiet settling, like the storm had passed, and whatever remained afterward had permission to stay. Elara found herself moving through her routine with more steadiness than before. Not because life had suddenly become simple, but because she was no longer holding her breath. The apartment above the bookstore was still hers, still filled with the same soft light in the morning and the same creaking floorboards at night. But it felt different now, less like a shelter and more like a home. Maisie had finished kindergarten and proudly declared herself a first grader in training, which meant she spent her afternoons crafting elaborate paper cities on the kitchen table and narrating entire soap operas for her stuffed animals. She no longer asked every day about Callum, but when she did, it was with calm familiarity, like mentioning someone who had simply become part of her orbit. Callum had kept his promise. He didn't force his way into their lives. He didn't use money or obligation to pull them closer. He showed up when invited, listened more than he spoke, and made space without asking for thanks. There was a slowness to his presence now, a kind of gentleness Elara hadn't seen in him before. He had stripped away the armor of the CEO, the strategist, the man who always needed to be 10 steps ahead, and in its place was someone quieter, steadier, not less powerful, but more human. One Sunday morning in late July, they drove out of the city together, just the three of them. It was Callum's idea, but Elara had agreed without hesitation. He had found a small rental home tucked into the hills east of the city, surrounded by tall trees and the low hum of wind through branches. It wasn't extravagant. In fact, it was rustic to the point of discomfort. No television, no Wi-Fi, no sleek edges, just bookshelves, windows, and space to breathe. They stayed for 3 days. The first morning, Maisie ran barefoot in the grass, her laugh echoing through the trees. Callum followed behind her at a slower pace, watching her movements like they were something sacred. Elara sat on the porch with a mug of coffee, half listening to the birds, half listening to her own thoughts. There was something about the simplicity of it all that made her ache. Not from sadness, but from the quiet, startling realization that this fleeting, ordinary peace, was what she had wanted all along. That afternoon, Maisie asked if she could ride a bike. They found an old one in the shed out back, its tires flat and handlebars rusted. Callum spent nearly an hour repairing it, kneeling in the gravel with sleeves rolled up and grease smudged across his hands. Elara watched him through the screen door, remembering the man she had met in that hotel bar all those years ago, and how impossible it would have been then to imagine this version of him. When the bike was finally ready, Maisie took a few hesitant pushes down the gravel path before falling sideways into the grass, unharmed but annoyed. She sat cross-legged and said, "This would be easier if someone just carried me." And Callum laughed so hard he nearly choked. Later that evening, after dinner and fireflies, they sat beneath a string of soft yellow lights hanging across the porch. Maisie was asleep inside, curled up with a picture book beside her. The air was warm, and the silence between them felt earned. "She's changed me," Callum said quietly, staring out at the darkness. "Not all at once, but completely." Elara didn't answer right away. She looked at him for a long time, trying to understand if what she felt now was trust or just the absence of fear. Then she said, "You didn't just come back. You stayed. That matters more than anything you could have said." He turned to her, and there was no plea in his face, no expectation, just a quiet kind of patience. "I don't know what we are," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what we'll be. But I know you're her father, and that means something." Callum nodded slowly. "It means everything." She looked away, blinking at the horizon where trees met stars. There was still distance between them, still history, still unspoken things. But there was no anger, no bitterness. Just two people sitting beside each other after all the noise had fallen away. The next morning, Maisie woke early and ran outside, calling for both of them. She had decided that today she would learn to ride the bike without falling, and after 3 failed attempts, she did. Her balance held. Her laughter cut through the trees. Elara clapped from the porch, and Callum ran alongside her for several yards before falling back, breathless and smiling. In that moment, beneath a sky streaked with morning gold, Elara felt something she hadn't let herself feel in years. It wasn't certainty. It wasn't even happiness in the way people described it in books. It was something quieter, deeper. It was the sense that they had finally arrived at the beginning of something real.